up time to begin our services this evening. If everyone would, let's turn to page 22. Page 22. We'll sing number 22, and after this song, I'm going to ask Tommy if we will lead us in an opening prayer. And then we'll go to our class. Page 22. Draw from the springs of salvation, give thanks to His great and holy name. Make known His deeds among the people, make known His exalted way. Praise the Lord, and shout for joy, for the Holy One is in our midst. Praise the Lord, and shout for joy, for He is in our midst. Call on His name with thanksgiving. Yes, joyously praise His name in song. Through love He offered our salvation. Through love He did give His Son. Praise the Lord and shout for joy, for the Holy One is in our midst. Praise the Lord and shout for joy, for He is in our midst. Let us pray.
Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us here together tonight and for clearing up the weather, making it easier for us to all be here safely. We ask that you be with us, be with our minds as we try to clear them so that we can learn something of your word tonight and better apply to our lives. Help us to push out all earthly worries and be able to focus here and now at the church family. Amen.
If you would, mark your song with page 284. 284 will be our song of invitation after class. Now we'll go to our class.
All right. We're in 1 Kings chapter 20. Is where we'll be tonight. The Huggins are out of town, so I am filling in. I don't know about you, but I feel like he's doing an excellent job teaching through 1 Kings, the divided kingdom. As we have started through this journey with all of these different kings, we have gone through these kings of Judah on the left, Rehoboam, Abijah, and Asa. And then in Israel, you have Jeroboam, Nadab, Baasha, Elah, Zimri, Omri, and Ahab. If you notice something about the list of Israel here, what do you see beside their name? How many good kings are there in the northern tribe of Israel? The answer is 0. There are no good kings, no kings that follow God. There are a few bright spots where kings actually do something that it's actually does follow God, but you would not call them a good king. And in the southern kingdom of Judah, are they all great kings? They're all good, right? Israel's all evil. Well, Judah doesn't fare a whole lot better. There's just a handful of kings that actually do follow God. And we'll notice those as we get through this. The guy that we're in the middle of his story right now is King Ahab. On the list of evil kings, where does Ahab rank? He pretty bad. And not only is he bad, what else is he known for is his family. Who is he married to? Jezebel. Have you ever met someone named Jezebel? I never have. And there's a reason for it. I mean, I'm sure you've met a lot of Daniels and a lot of Elizabeths and a lot of Hannahs. People love to name their kids after biblical names. I mean, my kids are Levi and Judah. But nobody names their kid Jezebel. Like, it's on one of the list of like words. At one point, it's actually illegal to name your kid Jezebel in certain states. That's how bad of a person she is. So, as we go through this, you'll see her in and out. You don't actually see her influence too much in chapter 20. And chapter 20 is actually one of the brighter spots in this section for Ahab. In the northern kingdom of Israel controls this whole territory right here, and Shechem is the capital city of the northern tribes. So as we get into chapter 20, King Ben-Hadad of Aram, so this area right up here, the king of Aram is coming down to fight against the northern kingdom of Israel. So let's start. Notice how big this army is as he's coming down. The question that we're going to ask is, what message does Ben-Hadad send to Ahab? Ahab is the king of Israel. So what is this Aramean going to say to him? So he's going to start in verse 1 of chapter 20. King Ben-Hadad of Aram assembled his entire army. 32 kings, along with horses and chariots, were with him. He marched up, besieged Samaria, and fought against it. How many kings are there in this battle? 32 plus him. I assume these are like city-states, but he's got a big coalition of people coming with him. We're going to see just how many in a little while. He sent messengers into the city to King Ahab of Israel and said to him, "This is what Ben-Hadad says, your silver, your gold are mine. Your best wives and children are mine as well." Then the king of Israel answered, "Just as you say, my lord, the king, I am yours along with all that I have." So, what is the message that Ben-Hadad sends to Ahab? Yeah, give me all your stuff, right? Your silver, your gold are mine. Your loveliest wives and children are mine. I don't know if that would save Jezebel or not. If she wasn't one of the loveliest wives, I don't know if she would be spared. By her character, she's not a lovely person. But that was a joke. I don't know if it fell flat. But I don't know about that. But he says, "Give me all your stuff." And how does Ahab respond? Yeah. What do you think of a king that acts that way? Well, that's very true. He hasn't placed his faith in God, and he's just going, okay, you're the big bad scary guy. He's the king of this little pipsqueak territory, and 33 kings are coming up against him. And he just says, "Okay, whatever you say, just take all of my stuff." So,
well, he doesn't have a lot of faith in God, so we've seen that examples before in the Bible where somebody does, and that doesn't make any difference, but
sure.
But this time he doesn't have any reason to think that God's going to help him because he doesn't believe, he's not a follower really of God anyway. So.
Yeah, remember what happened in just the last few chapters? You have that big showdown between the servants of Baal and Elijah on Mount Carmel, and Ahab's there, and Baal's are defeated, and Elijah thinks that there's going to be this great spiritual revolution, but Jezebel still wants to kill him, so Elijah runs away. Like, it is They've been spitting in the face of God. So why would Ahab expect a victory at all? So then, verse 5, the messengers then returned and said, thus speaks Ben-Hadad, saying, indeed I have sent to you, saying, you shall deliver to me your silver and your gold, your wives and your children, but I will send my servants to you tomorrow about this time, and they shall search your house, the houses of your servants, and it shall be that whatever is pleasant in your eyes, they will put it in their hands and take it. How good of a negotiator is Ahab? He doesn't negotiate at all at this point. So then he says, what's going to happen after that? Verse 7. Then the king of Israel called for all the elders of the land and said, recognize that this one is only looking for trouble, for he demanded my wives, my children, my silver, and my gold, and I didn't turn him down. All the elders and all the people said to him, don't listen or agree. So he said to Ben-Hadad's messengers, say to my lord the king, everything you demand of your servant is the first time I will do, but this thing I cannot do. What's the difference between Ben-Hadad's first demand and his second demand? Yeah, he's going to refuse the second demand. The first demand was the king's stuff, right? I'm going to take all of your stuff. And he's like, okay, I'll give it to you. Then Ben-Hadad's like, well, if it was that easy, then I'll send messengers and say, well, I'm going to take all the stuff of all of your servants too. And that's where Ahab then approaches all of the people and say, all right, they're going to take all of our stuff too. And they say, no, we're not going to give up our stuff. We're not going to give up our wives and our children and all of our possessions. He was willing to give up his, but not everyone else. So the messengers left and took word back to him. Then Ben-Hadad sent messengers and say, may the gods punish me and do so severely if Samaria's dust amounts to a handful for each of the people who follow me. What is Ahab saying here in verse 10? Is I have a bigger army than you have dust. That if Samaria's dust amounts to a handful for each of the people who follow me, you guys are nothing. I'm about to bring the hammer down on you. Now, this next verse, verse 11, I think is one of the coolest statements of anybody. And like this, if you want to put it on a coffee mug, like this is one that you could put on a coffee mug. And one of the coolest things that Ahab actually says, definitely. The king of Israel answered, say this, don't let the one who puts on his armor boast like the one who takes it off. What does that mean? Yeah. What does it mean? The one who puts on his armor shouldn't boast like the one who's taking it off. Yeah, he hasn't been through the battle yet. The guy who's taking off his armor can brag because he survived and he won. We have a colloquialism, don't count your chickens before they hatch. This is the war version of that. Don't brag too much because you just might not win. So a prophet comes to King Ahab. How has King Ahab treated the prophets of God up to this point? Jezebel had slaughtered a ton of them, and she was going to slaughter Elijah. So it's kind of rare for a prophet to even approach Ahab. So here comes a prophet to Ahab and says, this is what Yahweh says. Do you see this whole huge army? Watch, I'm handing it over to you today so that you may know that I am Yahweh, that I am the Lord. Ahab asked, by whom? It's like, me and what army? How am I going to defeat this thing? And the prophet said, this is what the Lord says, by the young men of the provincial leaders. Then he asked, who is to start the battle? And he says, you are. You are going to start the battle. So Ahab obeys God. What do you know? So what questions does Ahab ask when the prophet told him that the Lord would deliver the Syrians into his hand? What did he ask? Yeah, who starts it and with what army? Yeah. I will deliver it into your hand, but you shall know that I am the Lord. Ahab asked, by whom? By the young leaders of the provinces. You're going to get all the different people from your territory, and you're going to go fight. And then who's going to start the battle in order? And you're going to be the attacker. Does that seem weird to you? If you're the defender and you're inside a city, a walled city, why would you be the one to go attack the army when you've got the high ground? It usually doesn't make sense for the defender to be the aggressor, to go and attack.
Well, especially when the numbers are so radically different.
Yeah.
They were very small in number versus who was attacking them. Who was wanting to take over.
Absolutely.
It looks like it'd be suicide, basically.
So Ahab mobilized the young men of the provincial leaders, and there were 232. Like 232 guys. And after them, he mobilized all the Israelite troops. 7,000. So a total of 7,232 against 32 kings. So they march out at noon while Ben-Hadad and the 32 kings who were helping him were getting drunk in their quarters. The young men of the provincial leaders marched out first, then Ben-Hadad sent out scouts, and they reported to him saying, men are marching out of Samaria. So here comes 232 people. He said, well, if they've marched in peace, take them alive. If they've marched out for battle, take them alive. The young men of the provincial leaders and the army behind them marched out from the city, and each one struck down his opponent, so the Arameans fled, and Israel pursued them. But King Ben-Hadad of Aram escaped on a horse with the cavalry. The next question that we had, we're going to get to in a moment. What conclusion are they going to make was why they lost this battle? Enormous forces, and here comes Israel's troops out. Why does he say, take them alive either way? What does that tell you about his attitude? Yeah, we're confident they were going to. He's so overly confident that he's getting drunk on the battlefield, that he and the leaders are already partying like they've already won. They're bragging like they've taken their armor off. So, as we keep reading through here, verse 21. Then the king of Israel marched out and attacked the cavalry and the chariots. He inflicted a severe slaughter on Aram. The prophet approached the king of Israel and said to him, go, strengthen yourself and consider carefully what you should do, for in the spring the king of Aram will attack you. Now the king of Aram's servant said to him, their gods are the gods of the hill country. That's why they're stronger than we are. Instead, we will fight with them on the plain, and then we'll certainly be stronger than they are. And do this, remove each king from his position and appoint captains in their place. Raise another army for yourselves like the army you lost, horse for horse, chariot for chariot, and let's fight with them on the plain, and we will certainly be stronger than they are. The king listened to them and did it. In the spring, Ben-Hadad mobilized the Arameans and went up to Aphek to battle Israel. So what conclusion did they make as to why they lost so bad? Why did these, 232 people come out and whip our guys and make the rest of us run away, and then 7,000 come out and slaughter a bunch of the rest of us? What conclusion did they come to? Yeah, their God was stronger where? In the hills. Well, they must have the God of the hills, and their God is stronger than our God. Is that true? That Israel's God is stronger than their God? It is true, but is he only stronger in the hills? They make a conclusion, hey, we're from flat country. Our God is the God of the plains, so let's replace all of our army. Why would replacing the kings with captains be a good idea, perhaps? Captains are trained soldiers. Most of the time, kings aren't. Kings are the people that get drunk when the battle comes. Captains are trained soldiers. So we're going to come back with our army bigger, stronger than it ever was. So in the springtime, they come back again. So at this point, Ahab's been listening to God. So what's going to happen next here? So what happens the second time they come? So springtime, they're coming back. Verse 27, the Israelites mobilized, gathered supplies, went up to fight them. The Israelites camped in front of them like 2 little flocks of goats, while the Arameans filled the landscape. Then the man of God approached and said to the king of Israel, this is what the Lord says, because the Arameans have said, the Lord is God of the mountains and not a God of the valleys. I will hand over all this huge army to you. Then you will know that I am Yahweh. They camped outside, opposite each other for 7 days. And on the 7th day, the battle took place, and the Israelites struck the Arameans, 100,000 foot soldiers in 1 day. The ones who remained fled into the city of Aphek, and the wall fell on those 27,000 remaining men. Ben-Hadad had also fled and went into an inner room in the cities. So we'll pause there. How many men did Israel have in the first battle? Like 7,232, right? Do you think their army has grown tenfold from the time of that battle to the next spring? I don't think it's a lot bigger. If it is bigger at all, how are they compared? What analogy does he give? They look like 2 little what? Yeah, two little flocks of goats, where the opposing army filled the landscape. Overwhelming odds. And how many people fell? 100,000 foot soldiers in 1 day. Could you imagine 7,000 people beating 100,000? That's unbelievable. But God was with them. With those odds, could you attribute that to anything but God? And then the ones who run away, they go into a city, and then what happens to them in the city? A wall falls on them. What does that remind you of? Jericho. What was the message of Jericho? How did the walls of Jericho fall? Is it because they marched and stomped extra hard? God caused the wall to fall.
There's 27,000 died from the wall.
And 27,000 people died from the wall. Like, what's the conclusion that Ahab and the Israelites should make from this? Yeah. What did the prophet say? Why was God bringing them the victory? Was it because of Ahab's righteousness? Why did God use Ahab to fulfill his purpose? Why did the Arameans, why were they defeated? It's because of their wickedness. Here's an important thing from the Bible. Just because God uses somebody to do something good for his purpose doesn't give his stamp of approval on the person he uses.
I think that's an example we could use today.
Certainly.
I mean, we don't know, but some people say, well, it was divine intervention, that Trump
Perhaps.
was killed. It's not to say that God might be using him, but it's not because he's a Christian. So.
Certainly. Very true. How many times does God use wicked people to knock out other wicked people because their wicked time had come. Like, that is just the way. It is time for the judgment of the Arameans, and Ahab should be listening to God here. Here is the overwhelming proof. If Mount Carmel didn't prove it, now it does, that God is God. Yahweh is the only Lord. So, now Ben-Hadad, this great and mighty king, the braggart that has happened so far. Oh, well, before we get that, question number 11 in our book, what happens the second time Syrians came against Israel? They looked like two little flock of goats, and the Syrians fled, filled the countryside. Man of God comes and speaks to Ahab, and then they are destroyed. And Ben-Hadad also flees and goes into the city, into an inner chamber. So he wasn't close to the wall, evidently, so he's inside an inner room. So what does Ahab do now? Verse 31, the servant said to him, "Consider that we have heard that the kings of the house of Israel are merciful kings. So let us put sackcloth around our waists and ropes around our heads, and let us go out to the king of Israel. Perhaps he will spare your life." So they dressed him with sackcloth around their waists and ropes around their heads, and went to the king of Israel and said, "Your servant Ben-Hadad said, 'Please spare my life.'" So they dressed with sackcloth around their waists and ropes around their head, and went to the king of Israel and said, "Please spare my life." So he said, "Is he still alive? He is my brother." Ahab's a terrible negotiator. "Oh, Ben-Hadad, he's my brother." Now, when the men were looking for a sign of hope, they quickly picked up on this and responded, "Yes, it is your brother Ben-Hadad." They said, "Go and bring him." So Ben-Hadad came to him. Ahab had him come up into the chariot. Then Ben-Hadad said to him, "I restore to you the cities that my father took from your father, and you may set up a marketplace for yourself in Damascus, like my father set up in Samaria." Ahab responded, "On the basis of this treaty, I release you." So he made a treaty with him and released him. Now, I want to make sure that we have time to make this point. So I want to go on into the next section, and then we'll talk about Ahab's decision here. Ahab's decision, was it a righteous one? So what did Ahab do? Well, that's this question. What does he do after the second victory over the Syrians? What does he do to Ben-Hadad? He makes a treaty, makes an alliance with him, and lets him go.
He won. He could have done all that just because he wanted to. He didn't have to have the blessing of Ben-Hadad or whatever.
Sure. Maybe I'm going to get rich because you're going to set up a marketplace in Damascus, and we're going to be trade partners now. Like, that's the promise anyway. It's going to be interesting. The cities that they say that they are going to give back, that in just a few chapters they're going to have to go and attack. Like, it doesn't seem like Ben-Hadad's going to keep his end of the bargain. But who won the victory here? Did Ahab, was he the victor? Sort of. But whose victory was this, really?
God.
Whose prisoner was Ben-Hadad? Ben-Hadad was God's prisoner. Up to this point, Ahab's been listening to the prophet, but now here comes this great and mighty king coming groveling at my feet. Ahab's got little man syndrome, and when you're a small man, you tend to be more susceptible to brown nosing, to people puffing you up with words. Ahab feels like a big guy because here's this mighty king groveling at his feet in sackcloth and begging to spare his life. Let's see how this turns out. In verse 35, This is a weird section, but I think this is incredibly important for us to understand what it means. Verse 35, one of the sons of the prophet said to his fellow prophet, by the word of the Lord, strike me. But the man refused to strike him. He told him, because you did not listen to the Lord, mark my words, when you leave me, a lion will kill you. When he left him, a lion attacked and killed him. The prophet found another man and said to him, strike me. So the man struck him, inflicting a wound. Then the prophet went out and waited for the king on the road. He disguised himself with a bandage over his eyes. We'll talk about this discussion between this prophet and Ahab in just a moment. But what happens here? Here a prophet has a message from God, and he goes to another prophet, and he asks the other prophet to do what? Hit him. No, I don't want to do that. I'm not going to hit you. You're my friend. When God tells you to do something and you don't do it, what do we call that? That's disobedience. And disobedience to God we call sin. But it's weird that God's telling somebody to punch him in the face. If God tells you to punch somebody in the face, what should you do? You should punch him in the face. Does this other prophet understand? Does the prophet understand the command?
I'm sure he understood what the guy said.
Yeah, but do you think he understood the reasoning behind it?
No.
Are there some commands of God that sometimes we don't always agree with? We don't always want it to be the case. There's some things that God tells us to do that sometimes just don't make sense to us. I'll tell you of a specific example that I know of. Had a situation where a parent has a child who is very clearly living in sin. And what the Bible says to do when another brother is living in sin is that you are to practice discipline with them. That you're not even supposed to eat with such a person for multiple reasons. It's to show them, hey, I'm not going to pretend like nothing's wrong. I love you too much. But to actually practice the discipline that God says. But the parent was told me directly, I was like, I know what God's way is, but God's way won't work with her. And I was very surprised when I went to an event, and there she was, sitting right next to parents, laughing, carry on, like nothing was wrong. And I talked to the parents about it. I was like, what are you doing? This is not God's way. And he's like, well, God's way won't work. The whole family's been pulled away at this point. But when God tells you to do something, even if it's not pleasant, you need to do it. Even if you don't fully understand or think that that's the way that's going to work, you need to trust God. He's smarter than you are. And what's the outcome of this guy? What happened to this prophet who refused to punch the other prophet in the face?
Ate by a lion.
Well, he gets killed by a lion. We don't know if he eats him or not, but at the very least he gets killed. And to that point, was it back in chapter 13? Do you remember the story of the two prophets where a prophet speaks that, hey, God told me to come to get you to come to my house and eat and that type of thing. And he just made it up in his own head when God had told that other prophet, don't stop and eat. And then you remember what happened to that prophet? He got killed by a lion, and the lion just stood over top of him and didn't eat him. But he refused to do what God said. And the old prophet was condemned because he spoke when God hadn't spoken. When God says to do something, we need to obey. even if we don't think it's going to work in this specific situation or this scenario, what happens when you don't remove the leaven from the lump? To go back to the example that I had, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, when it talks about separating yourselves from a brother who's walking disorderly, you got to get that leaven out of the lump. As in, if you have sin in the church, what's going to happen? Is that sin going to stay isolated with just that one guy? It's going to spread. And what happened to my friends is they refused to do what God said, and it took the whole family away. And to me, this is needed. Even if God says, punch him in the face. Now, is it possible to be more merciful than God is? Think about it. Is it possible to be more merciful than God? Not righteously. This prophet who refused to punch the other guy in the face, why did he refuse? Presumably because he didn't want to hurt the other guy, right? He was being merciful. But you know how this applies to the other part of this story? Who was Ahab merciful to? It was to Ben-Hadad. Should he have been merciful to Ben-Hadad? Well, he's going to be condemned for it. Let's keep reading. Prophet, so verse 37, the prophet finds another man, tells the other man, strike me, and this guy goes through with it. And now this prophet evidently has a very visible injury on his head. So the prophet waited for the king on the road. He disguised himself with a bandage over his eyes. As the king was passing by, he cried out to the king and said, "Your servant marched out into the midst of the battle. Suddenly a man turned aside and brought someone to me and said, 'Guard this man. If he's ever missing, it will be your life in place of his life, or you will weigh out 75 pounds of silver,' or 1 talent of silver." Anybody got 75 pounds of silver laying around their house? Anybody? Okay. I mean, this is a death sentence, right? So, verse 40, while your servant was busy here and there, he disappeared. The king of Israel said to him, "That will be your sentence. You yourself have decided it." He quickly removed the bandage from his eyes. The king of Israel recognized that he was one of the prophets. The prophet said to him, "This is what the Lord says. Because you released from your hand the man I had set apart for destruction, it will be your life in place of his life, and your people in the place of his people." The king of Israel left for home resentful and angry, and he entered Samaria. Why did this prophet of God, why did he need to be injured? Why did he need to be injured so he could put the bandage over his eye and tell Ahab this story?
So he wouldn't recognize him.
Yeah, so he wouldn't recognize him. So he can get close enough. Now, if he had recognized him, Ahab probably would have put up his guard. But instead, he wanted Ahab to make a conclusion at the end of the story. And do you see this is obviously a made-up story by the prophet of Israel that God tells him. Does that remind you of anybody in the Bible? David and what was the name of the prophet with David? It's Nathan. When Nathan comes and tells David a story about this little lamb and then turns the story around him and said, "You are the man." Do you see how this is that same story? Well, a guy came up to me, and this guy's like bandaged with his eyes covered, and he's like, "Guard this person," and then I was just kind of not paying attention, and the guy ran off. And the king's like, "Well, I'm going to condemn you." And the prophet turns it right around on him, and it's like, don't you see that that's what you just did? And God says that instead of him being destroyed, you're going to be destroyed. Now, was Ahab more merciful to Ben-Hadad than God was? Yes. But it was an unrighteous mercy. Ben-Hadad was God's prisoner, not Ahab's.
Doing it for mercy though, or his own personal,
Sure.
what he could get out of it?
Is it possible for us to be too gentle and too quick to forgive and too merciful, you can even use that word, I guess, today? When someone is obviously living in sin, but you make excuses for them, and you're just not actually doing the right thing, well, yeah, well, you know, they're not Christians, but at least they believe something. But they're not obeying what God says. But you never really talk to them about it. Are you being more merciful towards someone than God thinks you should be? Like, Emily, go ahead.
I don't know that we're too quick to forgive, it's that we're quick to avoid
Yes.
calling it out or thinking about it. And we can hide our head under the sand too, and just act like it doesn't exist. Or sometimes we're more actively avoiding, like you can't pretend it doesn't exist, but you're not doing anything about it.
Exactly. Like,
We don't like the whole judges when it's not like there's a judge and it's everybody, you know, on the thing.
does God want us to cause conflict sometimes? He wants us to go not actually punch people in the face, but to convict them of sin. And if we tell God no, because then they may not like me, because that'll be hard, because they won't like it if I do, and we tell God no, I'm not going to go punch them in the face. You know, I'm not going to go teach them about God and convict them of sin. Then what are you doing? And the punishment fits the crime. What happens? What is told of Ahab? What punishment is he going to get? That he and his family are all going to be destroyed. You know, God didn't want Israel making treaties with people. I am your God. You don't make treaties with people. But God wanted Ahab to kill him. Ahab should have known this, but refused to do it. And so the prophet said, therefore your life shall go for his life, and your people for his people. And so that's the end of chapter 20. Now, as we get into chapter 21, something's interesting is going to happen. Like this story, this is the most unkingly-like story I can imagine. So I want to jump right into chapter 21. Does anybody have any comments or questions on chapter 20? All right, chapter 21 it's not long, so I'd love if we can get through this, but we're closely out of time. Sometime passed after these events. Naboth, the Jezreelite, had a vineyard, and in it Jezreel, next to the place of King Ahab of Samaria. So Ahab spoke to Naboth, saying, give me your vineyard so I can have it for a vegetable garden, since it's right next to my palace. I will give you a better vineyard in its place, or if you prefer, I will give you its value in silver. But Naboth said to Ahab, as the Lord is my witness, I will never give my ancestors' inheritance to you. So Ahab went to his place resentful and angry because of what Naboth the Jezreelite told him, and he said, I will not give you my ancestors' inheritance. He lay down on his bed, turned his face away, and didn't eat any food. What does Ahab ask of Naboth? Hey, I want your vineyard. It's right next to my house. It'd make a perfect vegetable garden for me. And does Ahab make a fairly reasonable offer, at least in Ahab's mind? Ahab thinks he's completely justified in doing this. Hey, I'm going to make a very reasonable offer to you. But what does he do when what does he do when Naboth won't sell him the vineyard? Yeah, sells up like a poison pup. I think that's the first time I've heard that one. He sounds like a 6-year-old. He just goes and just pouts. Because this guy won't sell me his vineyard. What does Ahab have as far as earthly possessions? He's a king. He's got whatever he wants. The person who is concentrated on possessions will put all of his energy on what he doesn't have. And he's just stewing over it. And he's pouting like a little 5-year-old. So here comes Jezebel. And if we haven't seen her character already, remember, she's the daughter of a foreign king. She's not an Israelite. But here's her plan. Verse 5, then his wife Jezebel came to him and said to him, why are you so upset that you refuse to eat? Because I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite, he replied. I told him, give me your vineyard for silver, or if you wish, I will give you a vineyard in its place. But he said, I won't give you my vineyard. Then his wife Jezebel said to him, now exercise your royal power over Israel. Get up, eat some food, and be happy, for I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. You know something he neglects to say in there? He doesn't give the reason. Why did Naboth not want to sell it? Because it's his ancestral home. It was part of his inheritance from God from a long time. But he neglects to sell that to Jezebel. So here's her plan. She's like, I'll get it for you. And then she goes and works her own plan. So she writes letters in Ahab's name and sealed it with his seal. She sent the letters to the elders, the nobles who live with Naboth in his city. In the letter she wrote, proclaim a fast and seat Naboth at the head of the people, so that then set 2 wicked men opposite and have them testify against him, saying, you have cursed God and the king. Then take him out and stone him to death. The men of the city and the elders and nobles with him in the city did as Jezebel had sent word to them, just as was written in the letters, so she had sent them. They proclaimed a fast, seated Naboth at the head of the village. 2 wicked men came in, sat opposite him. Then the wicked men testified against Naboth in the presence of the king, saying, Naboth has cursed God in the city. So they took him outside the city, stoned him to death with stones. Then he sent word to Jezebel, Naboth has been stoned to death. When Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned to death, she sent to Ahab, get up, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, who refused to give it to you for silver, since Naboth isn't alive but dead. When Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, he got up to go down to the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite to take possession of it. So what does Jezebel's plan tell us about her? She's mighty evil. Very, very evil. This wicked plan that she has. And she plans this big feast and has Naboth sit at the head table, and then has 2 people come in and as witnesses say, I heard Naboth curse God and the king. What does the 10 Commandments say? Remember what commandment number 9? What's that? Yeah, do not bear false witness. That was number 9 of the 10 Commandments. So she's breaking God's law in order to kill him. But we find out a detail in 2 Kings, and if you want to write this in your margins right next to this verse, put 2 Kings 9, verse 26. What do we learn in 2 Kings 9, verse 26? Whose blood was shed that day? It was Naboth and Naboth's sons. So no more people to inherit it. So now it's just free to whoever wants it. Well, isn't that convenient? And she goes back to Ahab. Does she explain her plan to Ahab? It's like, no. She just goes and says, hey, guess what? He's dead now. And so is his other sons. It's like, it's like they accidentally, you hear of conspiracy theories of, the enemies of political figures accidentally fall into a noose and accidentally hang themselves, or accidentally shoot themselves 12 times or things, like obviously by accident. That accidents happen, But this is what she does. Does Ahab condemn his wife for her actions? Not at all, because he gets what he wants. You see how he is such a little whiner crybaby? Not kingly at all. All right, well, we are going to pause there. So we'll start next week with a judgment on Ahab in verse 17.